Go. Welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm super excited to be here today with Faisal Mahbouba, a good friend of mine who we encountered each other, maybe 3 months ago or something. He reached out to me. I was involved in some John Vervaeke stuff, saw some of the work, thought we may do some coaching together. But then I realized this guy's got unbelievable talent and a truckload of stuff that I can learn from. So we just started hanging. He's got a remarkable perspective. And he does some super cool poetry, art, rap kind of blend stuff. And I decided I wanted to share that with the world, my little voice in the world around UTOK. So I invited him here. Faisal, hey, love to have you here.
Awesome, Greg. I'm super excited for this. I've been loving just hanging, just getting to know you and building this friendship. And yeah, super excited to be here, man.
It's great to have you. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background, kind of how you got into this space and what were some of the things you saw and then what attracted you to UTOK, and then we'll get into some of the art to share.
Cool. All right. Where to start? Okay. So how I got into this sphere, this realm of this little corner of the internet and the work that all of you do was actually through Jordan Peterson, like I think a lot of people initially.
Totally.
Going through some challenging times in my life and looking for some sort of guiding light. And Jordan Peterson's work was something that was kind of a call to action and forced me. Or even before that, I started reading Jung and psychology and a little bit of philosophy. So I had a taste from that, but it was still very abstract. I found Jordan Peterson and it started becoming more grounded, and I was learning how I could ground those concepts and ideas in everyday life. So from Jordan Peterson, I started kind of dabbling in a few other people's works, I should say. And then I found John Vervaeke. And then I think I started watching Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, maybe like 2020, I think, 2020, something like that.
Yep.
And then from there, I was just like, I started reading more. I started doing some practices, some basic practices here and there. And then over time, I just started, I think after 2 or 3 years, I think like maybe it was last year, I stumbled on your work, and it was powerful because I always felt something off with like my experience with psychotherapy and the field of psychologies and how it felt like there wasn't there wasn't any coherence, there wasn't any consilience in the way in which different therapists even define terms, right? Like everybody would equivocate, and like me having no background in the field, I still found it weird as an outsider, right? And then me reading all these books and kind of being like confused. It's like, I'm the one who's getting therapy, but I feel like you don't know what you're talking about when you're using every single one of these words. So yeah. So that's what brought me into your work.
There it is. Right? You aren't the one that's confused. It is the field that is confused. That's my expert opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what brought me into your work. And that's why I've stayed, and I've really tried to live these ideas and concepts and apply them in my life and see how I'm shaped by, like, one is like just how we really are just justifying apes. Right. And how that comes into play every aspect of every moment. Right.
Sweet.
And,
actually, let's double click on that just so UTOK's got a couple of our take home messages. And if there is one, that we could summarize in 2 words, justifying apes is arguably certainly one of the fundamental core. So that's right, folks. That's not really a debate, I would say, just any more than we're orgasms. We are apes, organisms. And how the hell that's
that too.
We're sexual apes, and then we justify why we're doing what we're doing, often through Freudian slips.
Yeah. That's exactly. Yeah. So that's how I kind of got into.
And you developed. Talk a little bit about some of your frames about the way you frame experience and how you think about recursion. You have some really, really powerful ideas about the ways in which you sort of think about first, second order kinds of. Share us a little bit about that. I was really impressed by that, and that's some of the stuff we've really riffed off of quite a bit.
Yeah. You mean the stages, the 4 stages? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is kind of like something that I've been kind of developing and working on for like maybe 6 years now. And it started when I started learning about psychology and started learning about what projections are, and started to use projections as a point of self-reflection for the sake of deepening myself, my awareness of self and how I act in the world and the things that I say, and how that manifests in relationships. So I kind of started without really, at first, I wasn't really conscious, but developing kind of a model of how I see different levels of my experience, and in turn, different levels of other people's experience in a way.
Right.
So, like, first level is like projections of the ego. I think a lot of people, most people, and we're talking about verbals, right? A lot of people live on this level. They live through their projections. They see their projections as reality. And even though projection is something like kind of a fiction that our ego creates for the sake of preserving the fallacy or facades that we're living in present moment, that keeps us away from kind of falling into the depths of our own unconscious, right, in a way, and having to really face our shadow.
Yeah, so let's just put that in real quick UTOK terms, okay? At a base level, you have an ego, the mental organ of justification. It's got to tell a story about who the self is and what the self is doing. And this first order story is kind of a naive, realist view that also is biased and blind in certain ways to its own motives, to preserve itself as a justified state of being. Without any meta reflection on it doing that, it just is that. It doesn't realize that it's trying to do that without realizing there's a higher order process that is shaping and organizing the reason the world looks this way. It's not like the world has to look this way. It has to look this way from this frame. And inside the frame, the world just presents, and it just seems, of course the world is this way. When in fact, enormous amount of it is placed on this way by a frame that the person is bringing to bear that they're pretty blind to.
Exactly, right. And so that's thank you. Yeah, like that being within the frame without realizing that it actually is a frame, and it isn't the totality of reality. And I think that's a big difference, right? It's like
the totality
recognizing,
of
right? Right. And that's the thing. It's like the totality. A lot of people, when they live in projections, they're like, this is all that there is. And it's hard for people to communicate, I think, with other people when both sides are in this round, because it's like, I'm right, and then you think you're right, I think I'm right, and then we're arguing, period, right? Like it's adversarial processing where we're trying to convince the other person and denigrate and degrade the other side for the sake of preserving our own fiction. Because if we open up to the other side to any degree, we gotta realize that we're limited, right? We gotta realize,
and that always is successful. When you tell other people you're wrong, you're distorted. I see things truly. People are always like, oh my God, that's right. I'm now going to update my distortions based on what you just said.
Right?
Barely the way it works.
That always happens. That's good. That's common, man. Come on. Yeah. So that's
okay. So that's the first layer.
Yeah.
And then so what happens after that?
Yeah. So what happens after that for me, like, well, first name something about the first layer, projections of the ego. In Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, John talks about wantonness. And I think there's a loose mapping here. I don't know how concrete the mapping is, but wantonness as in this impulsive compulsion to act from the ways that we are affected by the world. right? Or other people. And it's this compulsion to react to whatever external stimuli is that we are being exposed to. Right. So I think that's one, like that impulsive compulsion is a big aspect of those projections that we take as truth. Right.
Right.
So,
and I'll just pause you right there.
Yeah.
One of the things in
Yeah,
psychotherapy that I'm almost always teaching folks is the difference between reactivity and responsivity. Okay?
Exactly.
So reactivity, I get primed and I'm responding, reacting without reflecting at all. It's just there's this basically stimulus response, and often when people are injured and when they're threatened and they're exhausted, and you go to this base, but there's a fundamental vulnerability and a fundamental stimulus response reactivity that's at the root of a lot, and getting folks out to both see that and take a step back from that is a key and almost ubiquitous process in psychotherapy. I mean, depending a little bit on where the person is, but if they're there, that's one of the things you absolutely have to do if you're going to loosen responding to increase flexible adaptive awareness.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you said it, like that stepping back, that capacity to step back from whatever, maybe the frame or even like the emotions that we're experiencing while we're inside of the frame, that capacity to step back and look at the frame or look at our experience as that metacognitive observer. And I think on the first level, that's what's lacking. It's that capacity. Exactly.
Flashlights, right?
Right. I have that too, right here.
All right, there we go. We have our Kamemo flashlights. And then we get hey, can you get a responsive meta observer in relationship to see the framer?
Exactly, right. And I think that's the only way one can step back and not be gripped by the compulsive impulsivity or the impulsive compulsion of the projections and the way that we are, that way that we react to affect and stimuli that we are exposed to, right?
Right.
Or that the affect that's induced within us in reaction to the stimuli that we experience, right? So the second level I call reflections of the self, reflections of the ego, right? So reflections of the ego is that capacity to step back and reflect upon what it is that we are assuming and projecting onto the world. And this is very challenging to get to break through, to reach this step of this capacity to look at our thoughts as thoughts. And it doesn't even need to take, I think in the beginning, take the recognition of thoughts as thoughts, but it's just the capacity to be able to start to reflect upon one thought and not stop at that one thought as truth. It's like, okay, I think this about this person in front of me. Okay, am I going to just take that first thought that comes to mind as truth and act on it and live my life and see the world from that place? Or am I going to learn to challenge that in some way, even if it's just through another thought? Right. So that's why I say reflections of the ego, because this is still the narrating self reflecting upon itself.
Gotcha. Yep. Okay.
Right. So that level
this is opening up some space to question. So now the naive real and its absolute reality now is, wait a minute. Reality may be more complicated than my first thought about it.
Exactly. Right. And so this is reflection, right? Our capacity to reflect upon our experience and the ways that we act in the world, the things that we say, and the way we show up in relationships. It's that capacity to like you said, step back and reflect. And I think a big part of that is being able to recognize your projection as assumptions, expectations, and judgments, right? All three or one or how they fit together, and challenging them to a degree for the sake of getting closer and deeper in touch with reality. Right. And that process is, I think, that level, that reflection. But there's a problem here. And the problem here is the reflectiveness gap, right? It's Hamlet. It's this is again from Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. I learned this from John And so it's that reflectiveness gap of stepping back from the frame and reflecting upon it. But then stepping back, and the continuous stepping back actually strips one of one's agency, because there is no stepping into the frame. There's just this reflection that creates such a gap between the person as a metacognitive observer,
Yep.
and then our embodied experience in the world, right? And that difference becomes so great where we're stripped of our agency. And for me, I've lived on this level for a long time, disassociated a lot of my life, and just constantly reflecting on the world to where I become paralyzed.
Right.
Paralyzed by my analytical mind. Right.
So, you mentioned Hamlet here. So Hamlet, classic soliloquy, and then all of a sudden it's layer upon layer of abstraction. I think lots of people would say some of our trouble. Benita Roy, for example, would sort of get in a layer upon layer of abstractions, as some of the same with Rich Blundell in relationship to some of the trying to seek truth in propositions, and then propositions upon propositions, and then being disembodied, disconnected, potentially from lived experience.
Exactly. Yeah, I have a piece about this actually, and it's touching upon my experience with this, and it's like this is a full piece, but I'll just say a few lines that are relevant for this, for the sake of what we're talking about right now. It's like, often my thoughts are just distractions, masking some sort of call to action. I tend to lose myself in abstractions and ideas I attach to. My body telling my mind to step back but not move backwards. It's about time I learned to be embodied, the only way to find true peace and meaning that's everlasting. Right?
Yeah. See?
So, yeah.
Right? I several times in therapy, I've reflected, like, you're really in your head. Like to people, it's like especially men, they're more likely men, and just this recursive analysis that is totally, disconnected from the heart. And you put that beautifully there.
Yeah, exactly. That disconnected from a heart is a big aspect. It's like, it's that dissociated floatiness, right? It's like, for me, that's what it was, to where I would not be able to really experience my emotions. I would think about what it would be like to experience my emotions.
Yep.
And I got so good at that to where people would think I would actually be very expressive. But when I would tell them I'm actually very disconnected, like when I got close to someone and tell them I'm actually very disconnected from my emotions, they actually become really surprised. Like, oh, what? Like, you're very expressive. But I got so good at that acting, that I got so good at analyzing and breaking down, oh, how would I react if I really experienced this emotion? Right. So then I would act it out. Right. So that's that dissociated state to where like I would be able to think about things deeply and act from those thoughts, but I would never actually have an embodied sense of being in the world.
Lovely.
Right.
And by the way, like in COM-MO, M, motivated toward valued states of being. Okay. It is about re-engaging the wisdom stack. So you reflect, and then you are leaning into the world toward valued states of being.
Exactly. Right. Definitely. And at that level, sorry, go on. What were you going to say?
No, I said that's one of the things it does capture and speak to is this danger of stepping back into the abstracted abyss.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And some of the dangers from that is a derealization and depersonalization. Right. And for me, that was my experience a lot of my life, both. And it was hard to even distinguish between the two. It's like, was I feeling not real, or was the world feeling not real, or is neither real? Right. So it's really that those, I think, came together for me in a profound sense. Right. So that's the second level of like reflections of the ego. Right. And the problem comes with the reflectiveness gap. And I think the way to ameliorate the problem of the reflectiveness gap is a dialectic between the first two levels, between being within the frame and acting in the world, and having the metacognitive observer and being able to reflect on it, right? And this is your article about the emotional sweet spot.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
Between the finding a dialectic between regulation and attunement.
Exactly. So
Right.
just so people know what UTOK advocates for is a coherent integrated pluralism across the stack. Okay. And we're talking here about the first loop. Okay, is just this reactive loop. Then we get a reflection on it. However, the reflection gap is potentially people can abstract that into forever, and now they're disconnected head and heart. Okay, living in a heart that feels derealized, depersonalized, etc. In lesser cases, just hyper abstract and not in touch, right?
Yeah.
With the world, what's going on there? We need to reintegrate the first and second order loops, okay, in a constructive dialectic, a coherent integrated dialectic. Part the way you do that, part of the reason you dissociate is because affect is really painful and people don't know how to relate to it. They don't know how to take the ego and re-engage its embodiment. So that's what you're saying. You want to re-engage the embodiment. What's the best way to re-engage the embodiment? Well, the relating to it with a reflection of engagement. And that engagement holds it in the sweet spot of being aware and attuned on the one hand so that you can shine the light of your attention and narrator and pull with coherent integration what the frequent resonance of the message of your emotion, energized action telling you about your goal states and your needs and what's happened to you. Okay, you can be aware of that, hold it with acceptance, and also adaptively regulate it. It is a primate way of being in the world, and we are persons. And if you act on your first reaction, right, as a primate, you find yourself in a lot of trouble. So you actually need adaptive regulation, and it is then the integration of the messaging, the feeling, with adaptive regulation toward goal states that can, I think, be this, what you are describing then as this constructive opponent switching between the first and second layer.
Yeah. And it's the dialectic relationship between the first and second layer to where I can see my projection, recognize my projections, reflect upon my projections, but then rather than constantly reflect, get to a point of reflection to where I can step back into the frame after creating a new frame and being able to act in the world, reclaiming the agent arena relationship. Right.
Excellent.
Finding a way to greater realize that agent arena relationship with a wider set of affordances by means of reflection that allows us to step into the world and act from a place of greater agency. Right.
That's lovely. And I'll just make a very strong parallel with my friend philosopher Rob Scott, who does what he calls identity shifting. And it's got a fundamental shift, but this is exactly his identity shifting. Step outside, see the lensing through which you have projected the world, step back in with adaptive lensing capacities to place the appropriate lens of engagement in relation. Great.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually, I wrote a piece about this. So I think this is apropos because like it's right now where we just talked about the first two layers or levels, and the third one, I think this piece is a good transition to talk about the third one. So this is inspired by a lot of different things, but again, I wrote this when I was watching After Socrates.
Okay.
And I think John was talking about Stoicism.
So is this one of the pieces you'll share with us? One of the three pieces you'll share with us?
Yeah, this will be, and this is a shorter one. So yeah.
Okay, great.
Okay. I'm starting to learn how to discern my interpretation from the event. Lately, I've observed that I'm only ever disturbed by the expectations that I project. And the failure to accept the limitations of my attempts to infer my way through uncertainty. I'm far too attached to my intellect. Possessed by cause and effect, propositional thoughts will never make up for a lack of perspective. Right?
Lovely. Okay, so that's beautiful. Let's hit on a couple of things here that are super important. Expectations and acceptance. are super important concepts. Okay. So just pay attention to yourself. All right. You will notice that your emotions, okay, energized reactions, are unbelievably tied to your expectations. Okay. They are not just absolutist kinds of structures going on in the world. All right. They relate enormous. So you can have had a great time of your life, but if you were expecting this to be an unbelievable time and put all of your apples in it, then all of a sudden you're disappointed. Okay. Yep. And things could be somewhat miserable, but if you expect them to be, you're actually kind of happy. Okay. So that's just an easy way of saying. And the other thing that's unbelievably crucial is to recognize the projection of expectation relative to the isness of the event, right? And to be able to be in touch with that and to be able to have the capacity, the robustness and the courage and the clarity of thought and emotion of being to accept what is in the world relative to what you expect to be, and how to ultimately learn to relate to that isness is fundamentally crucial. So that was both beautiful and insightful, and that's why we're doing this. So because your work's both beautiful and insightful, in my opinion. So,
thank you, Greg. So actually, it's amazing that you brought that specific aspect of that piece up, the expecting versus accepting, because I have another piece on that, and it's talking about I'm starting to learn. I'm trying to shift from the perspective of expecting to accepting of what's being presented to me in the present, right? And it's that changing, that recognition of the way we are relating to the present moment. And that shift is powerful when we shift from expecting to accepting, because of exactly what you said. I don't need to say any different way. You said it great. Like, and it's like, that has been a big shift in my life, being able to coming to a situation without having, or at least limiting or recognizing my expectations, and through being in the world, through being in the present in terms of the relational quality of presence, what's present with me to what's present around me, presence, right? So that accepting allows us to a greater variety and field of affordances, because our expectations restrict our lens and we start narrowing our scope on the world and our everything that can take place. And we try to fit everything into this tiny box. Right.
Okay, so let's just put this in, let's see what we're creating here, folks, okay? So people grow up in the world as little primate persons, okay? And they start gripping the world, they're narrating, right? And then they're just like, here's the world, and I'm gonna react to it. I got my expectation projecting, and then shit happens, and then when it's good, great. If not, I'm gonna react to it, okay? And then we start to grow up, ideally, and then realize that you are a framer on the world, a projecting framer, trying to force the world into your boxes that you want to see. Oh, good. Now we can see that, right? Careful about just doing that, because then you run off into abstraction. You then have to take that capacity, reintegrate it, and then there's a way to reintegrate it, right? Yeah. One way to integrate is recognize the expectations that trigger, and don't be a slave to those. They're inevitable to some degree, but also how you bake them in and grip them and are attached to them, to use a mindfulness kind of Eastern frame. How do you let go of your attachment of that expectation and then align yourself with the capacity to be present with what is, okay? And then be moving toward valued states of being from as you ride the wave. We talk about actually, you talk ride the wave. This is the coherent wave of integration. To be present in the now in relation to what is. So you're describing that brilliantly, and that's exactly what we're trying to do to get people in right, healthy relationship to the moment.
Yeah, exactly, right. And the piece that I just read, it touches upon the problem of projection, touches upon the problem of reflection, because I start with I'm starting to learn how to discern my interpretation from the event, right? It's like it's the problem in the projection level is that those are confused. Those are fused together in a inappropriate way. Right. And then the reflection, it's like possessed by cause and effect, right? And it's like what I said, I think it was, I'm far too attached to my intellect for me. Like, and this is personal, that piece is partly personal because of that part of it. It's like, I'm far too attached to my intellect, going back to the loss and abstractions piece, right? And then what I say at the end to kind of transition into that third level is propositional thoughts will never make up for a lack of perspective, right? And that lack of perspective, part of what I said earlier was that um and I can't infer my way through uncertainty. And this is inspired by John talking about, I think, Agnes Callard's, I think it's Agnes Callard's transformative experience.
Okay.
Oh, no, Agnes Callard talks about, I think hers is aspiration. I forgot the other author. She talks about transformative experience. I think that's the name of the book. Forgot her name. Oh, man. Okay, so
I'm blanking on it.
yeah, so she talks about like with John talking about her work talks about we can't infer our way through uncertainty. On the brink of a transformative experience, we can't use propositions and like our standard rationality and our analytical mind to know what we're going to be like after the shift and change, like becoming a parent, right? Like you can't plan for that, right? And so that's what that last line is pointing to. It's like propositional thoughts will never make up for a lack of perspective, right? And in order to have a perspective, one needs to participate in a perspective, right? So that's kind of getting to the deeper layer of like John's like participatory knowing, right? And that brings me to the third level. So it's projections of the ego, reflections of the ego, and then the third level is realization of the self. I recently changed it. So realization of the self, right? So this level of realization of the self is the realization, as in Nishitani's double entendre way of using realization, making more real as well as recognizing, right? Recognizing and coming into awareness. It's the realization of the self. And the self, what I'm using here, I'm trying to be as clear as possible here. And I think I'm really influenced when I use self here by The Elusive I, the series you guys did. And it's the self as the logos of the psyche. It's the space or the through line between all of our different perspectives and the space through which we shift between perspectives. Right. And that the through line between all these perspectives, I'm calling the self. So when we drop down to this level and hold that dialectic between the projections and our reflection, we start realizing that we're neither our projections or our reflection. The self is something deeper. The self is something that exists at a level, and it exists and it doesn't exist in terms of like a lot of it is unrealized and unmanifest. It's the logos, the logos of our psyche. So it discloses and withdraws, right? There's being and becoming, right? And those live in those live like two sides of the same coin, right? So the realization of the self is that capacity of perspectival shifting. It's that developing of the capacity of perspectival shifting and not being consumed by any one perspective and role that we play, because we're always playing roles in one sense or the other, right? And at this level, there's a way in which we are afforded more agency because we are able to take into account many different perspectives rather than just be inside of one and be constrained and limited by that one. We are able to step back and see, okay, what can I, like for me, like I'm also a massage therapist. I write, and I've been exposed in a lot of many environments. So it's like, am I going to just pull from my one perspective of a massage therapist and what I've learned in that? Or am I going to be able to pull when I'm like treating somebody? Am I going to be able to pull from my background as a strength and conditioning coach? Am I going to be able to pull from my background as an artist and look at this in a way? Maybe it requires some sort of stepping. I said artist. I don't like calling myself an artist, but
that's how we're presenting you here. So it's cool.
Right? Okay, let's move on. That sounded very self-aggrandizing.
I'm calling you the artist, so we'll call it that way. I'll take responsibility.
That's hilarious. So you're like, am I able to pull from my many different perspectives that I inhabit throughout my life? If I am able to do that, and I realize that capacity to do that greater, then I have more affordances in every situation in my life, because I'm widening my capacity to see what it is that's in front of me. Right? Is that clear? Does that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, so we can put this in a little bit of UTOK language. So we're now aware of the frame, okay? Then you have the frame of the moment. And then when we talk about the self, okay, so you have your frame of awareness, that's your mind's eye. And then we argued in Elusive Eye that mammals, because you can project yourself across time, multiplicity of different situations will change, but what doesn't change, or at least what changes minimally, is the self. So the self then is yourself in environment A, self in environment B, self historically. There is a eidetic through line of organization of experience that then is organized and then made relevant to the self. Okay, first in the environment and relationship, and then very much in relationship to other people for social primates, and then a justified self across the story of the self for the ego. And so each frame then is coming in and then is getting referenced in relationship to the network of associations that are relevant for the self. In UTOK language, specifically iQuad coin language, the human identity function is your capacity to step back, see the ontic epistemic moment of awareness, that's the framing, and then recognize the human identity functional matrix, which is then the network of associations in regards to the self. So now, and then the capacity to hold that as being and becoming, hold that in the being becoming space to say that's the realization of the self is a beautiful way to put that.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you. That's great. And like that being and becoming for me maps as like soul spirit and that axis.
Totally.
Right.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So I am anchoring my soul. For me, I would say people do use this, but it's really the dialectic. But for me, I'm engaged in ensoulment, which then is the bottom up being, and I'm oriented to the potentiality becoming, which is the spirit. When I actually connect that, it all becomes one. Fundamentally, but I am oriented towards the becoming of my spirit. That's when I orient towards the ESG, the elephant sun god, or have wisdom energy organization. That's my spirit, my soul finding its path to the spirit and on the right path of being and becoming.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And like finite transcendence also comes to mind there. Is that being grounded in our finitude, but also recognizing our capacity to transcend our present constitution, right? But it's not, we're never transcending our finitude. That is something that's constant, right? So that holding that is, I think, also maps onto that pretty nicely.
Totally.
Yeah, and like you said, the eidetic through line. It's like, it's like the multi-aspectuality of our identity and our experience. Right. And it's like the through line between all those different perspectives each perspective is also like an aspect of self.
Yep.
Right. We can never see every aspect of anything. Right. But there's a through line that is not an aspect in itself. And that's what we're pointing at to the self here. It's like, right. So, yeah. So that's the third level, and that being able to step back and notice our frame and shift between frames, come back after creating a new frame. And I think at this level, something that's really powerful for me, and I think for a lot of people that take part in like mindfulness, and I'm using mindfulness in the way John does, contemplation and meditation, the capacity to step back and reflect upon how we're framing the world. And then that's a meditation for me. It has helped me realize what's me and what are the ways I'm attaching to different identities and different experiences and seeing through my past and they're shaping my lens and different lenses, I should say. So it's like meditation has helped me step back and look at the framing, right? And John talks about this a lot, right? And then contemplation has helped me, okay, like how am I seeing the world differently now? Like, did I recognize the ways that I might be self-deceiving in any way? And like, is this working? Stepping back to the frame and contemplating, as in like contemplating, trying to recognize all the ways my process of sense making has changed and developed, right? So that level, that's helped me something that's helped me realize and deepen my capacity to
Nice.
Be a self is meditation and contemplation, and in that way that I just described.
Gotcha. Excellent.
Yeah. So so the last levels, if this last level is very hard, you can't really articulate it, right? It's very participatory, right? So I call it the real self-expression of reality, inspired by Nishitani and Religion and Nothingness. And Nishitani defines religion as the real realization of real reality, and he uses realization there in the double sense, right? And for me, I'm coming at this from a kind of a individual perspective. So like when he talks about religion, I think the real self-realization of reality is more encompassing to talk about the community aspect of religion, even though he talks about religion as always being an individual's experience of that. But I wanted to distinguish a little bit here between the realization. For me, I use the real self-expression of real reality, because there's a way in which we are an expression of reality, right? To a degree. And then it's like we're constantly, there's a cycle of being impressed and expressing from the ways we're being impressed by the world. And it's that agent and arena relationship that is constantly in a cycle. There's this reciprocal opening that happens, and it can be a reciprocal narrowing, but I mean, when we're at this level, there's a reciprocal opening between the ways we're being impressed by the world and the ways we are expressing as a pretty much embodied instantiation of reality. Right? So there's a cycle that's happening there. And so the real self-expression of reality for me, I don't mean expression as in like the very individualistic, constrained way of, oh, I'm going to say my truth. It's like, no, like there's no your truth. Truth is a normative category, right? So I mean that in a deeper sense, as in when we tap into, I think Rob Scott's isness, when we make that fundamental shift and step back from all our framing, there's a way in which we drop in and the distinction between agent and arena dissolves. Right? So agent becomes an expression of arena, arena becomes an expression of agent. And there's a this, even talking about this is hard because it's like there's only the participatory sense that's left, right? The ontic epistemological experience of this, right?
So I'll make a comment, then we got to get to your art, and we'll jump into that. Okay. You and I were talking the other day, I think, and we were talking about emptiness. Remember that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And you helped me. You I think through conversation with Ethan, you gave me a word that I then celebrated all day and shared it with Marcia. What was the word that you gave for me for this?
Yeah, so I got this from Ethan. Ethan and I had a just amazing conversation about this. And I think I said it wrong last time. It's vacuity. Last time I said vacuosity.
Wow.
So it's actually vacuity. So vacuity, as in Ethan told me that he was having a conversation with someone who's deeply involved in Buddhism and has very well read, very well read in Buddhism. And they were talking about how the translation of emptiness might not be great. Because just to make it short, he said emptiness, there's a sense of passivity. There's a sense of there's like just nothing. And it's hard to really embody and encapsulate when we just say it as emptiness. And he said vacuity might be a better translation, because for me, my interpretation of vacuity, it's like a flowing through an empty vessel. Right. Yep. And it's like a vacuum, or like we talked about, like vacuous being something being vacuous nowadays, very a negative thing to say. Like you don't want to hear someone say you're vacuous, right?
Right. And that's where I really like the term, in the sense that so one of a simple way of talking about some aspects of mindfulness, what they're trying to do is detachment. Okay.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing in all of this, and what I hear certainly with Rob Scott and how he's taught me about the fundamental shift and isness, is this: we have this remarkable capacity to be aware, right? The frames force, and we grip on them motivationally, and then we want to see, and then you got this reflection, and then you live through, and then you get, and I got flavors of this, and now I can really tap into this. There's this oneness, it sounds like there's this real diffusion of pure awareness, in the world, whereby the gripping of the frames, they're certainly there. You can't have awareness without some aspectualizing, but the letting go and the recognition of the imputing of it as vacuous, right? Yeah. And then being with the agent arena flow as isness itself, right? And not even impute any attachment to it, not impute any kind of, and simply live. Find yourself living in that resonance. That's an unbelievably beautiful thing. I think it's a profound thing. I think it is, what I would point to with emptiness. With the vacuous thing, it gets the flow down, and it also points to the pointlessness of our egoic gripping, or at least as a way to allow you to let that go. And just, it doesn't eliminate it, but the attachment to it shifts, and then you relate to the whole flow differently.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the other day I was thinking about this, and I was trying to make a pre-trans distinction here. And I just put it simply in a few words. I said, okay, so the projections of the ego and that realm of verbals, vacuous vessels possessed by energy and information. Mm-hmm. There's a way where we're possessed by it, and we act by being possessed by this energy information, and we react, right? And then the trans, the more the transcendent aspect, the quality of vacuity, I think, is vacuous vessels flowing with energy information. Right? There's a flowing, there's a with, there is a ceasing of being possessed, and a ceasing of being possessed, right? So it's that flowing with and being by means of that flowing with, and actually as that flowing with, that is what being is here, the flowing with energy information, or flowing as energy information, right? Versus being possessed by. So vacuous vessels possessed by energy information, which is kind of the pre-egoic, and then the trans-egoic, it's that vacuous vessels flowing with energy information, or flowing as energy information, right?
Totally.
So so those are kind of the four levels, and so that's kind of the way I map the world and how I see the world, and how that helps me kind of as a developmental ladder. For me, it's a nested hierarchy, and they are all interdependent, and they are all recursive. Every level is recursive upon the other.
And then doesn't the last one go to one, right?
Yeah.
So here's the way I would map it. So you have life doing its thing, and mind, right, doing its thing evolutionarily, and then out of that we get this ego that starts to possess and grip, right, and pull out, and then it's a possessing vessel that's trying to jam the world with a narrative, right? So now you get there's a pre, and then there's an ego, and then we get a trans reflector on that, right? That then gets re-ingrained, and then ultimately expands so that the trans hits the pre, and I would then say you get wisdom energy. You get the flow of wisdom energy. And so it's a pre-trans unity. That's why I wanted to bring and it comes back to one. It grows and then drops, and then becomes a wisdom energy unity.
Exactly. And I have a piece of an early conception of an early symbolic conception of the pre-trans. For me, it's yeah. So I'll leave that for people to go to on their own. And so yeah, so
Okay,
I guess
so
that it's
so there
time
it
for
is.
the work,
We're 50 minutes in. We got one
right?
piece in, but I want to make sure. So that's lovely. This is why I wanted to have this conversation. It gets me excited, at least, because it's so. We're climbing up this mountain in different ways, and then we're like, oh my God, there's so much alignment. So much beautiful alignment. So it's really cool.
Yeah.
So yes, let's transition a little bit and set up an art piece here. Not that I think there's already been a lot of art expressed, in my opinion, but let's go with a piece here that you chose to share. I think the audience now has a sense of your capacity and thoughtfulness on these issues.
Okay, so the first piece that I wanted to share is one that I wrote it during a pivotal time in my life where I was trying to figure out how I can be in the world and better be in service. Service is a big theme of this piece. And I was really gripped by this sense of like almost like anxiety. And I think a lot of people are possessed by this feeling nowadays, trying to figure out what to do in the midst of this meta crisis. I know a lot of people who are like, is me working on myself really going to do anything when we don't have much time in the midst of this meta crisis? How do I change the world without changing myself? Right. And I think a lot of people strive like to try to find some way of doing that, but it's impossible. Right. And people become gripped and crippled and paralyzed by the combinatorial explosion of the immensity of the world and the problems that arise within the world, and they disassociate their own experience from that. But I think the only way we can ever address the meta crisis is by addressing ourselves, each as individuals in relationship, being and as an embodied entity of self-reflection and these four levels that we talked about, and whatever other conception we can conceive of these four levels, being participating in that act of transcending oneself by way of learning through every moment. Every moment of experience can be a lesson, and we are revealed to ourselves every moment that we live, right? So all that to say was this feeling came from that state of almost like a hubristic, how can I change the world, be in service? Right. So this is the piece.
Okay.
I need to purge myself from this incessant sense of urgency. I know this is just the manifestation of my fear of uncertainty. Lately, I've been feeling burdened with an emerging sense of purpose to be in service to the people hurting, cursed by the circumstances that they've been birthed into. See? Before the day my flesh returns to the earth, I need to know I did all I could to serve justice to the ones deserving of her. And in turn, inspire the courage to tame the eternal serpent that lurks within each of us for the sake of reclaiming one's self-worth and sense of trust in the universe. Because that's the only way any of us will ever be free.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. I think I'd captured a lot of the angst, confusion, passion, urgency, how to frame it. Yeah. So where does that leave you? What is that? What is that? Are you still in the angst as a function of that? Do you find yourself flowing in how to be in this chaotic time, and also finding peace and beauty and all of that?
Yeah. So yeah, that was closer to the start of my journey. I wrote that. And yeah, like from that point, from after actually literally like almost like immediately after writing it, I was like, shit, the only way any of us will ever be free is by reclaiming one's self-worth and sense of trust in the universe, and taming the eternal serpent that lurks within each of us, right? And there's a way in which one can over-explain and break down the art. So I'll leave it at that in terms of addressing the piece directly.
All right.
But from that point, I did a lot of internal work and dove in and really dedicated all my time to learning about my own experience, my own reactions, and how I come into relationship, and everything going on inside of myself, right? And I continue to do that every day. But that was a big shift after writing this piece, from looking externally to looking inward. And how can I change inward to have an impact outward by being an embodied example of the change that I want to see.
Lovely.
Right.
Lovely.
So,
Perfect. Yep. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I think this is a struggle. I even, when I considered sort of internalized global civilization collapse, the meta crisis, etc. Part of my whole transition, actually, through, I have a continued wonderful relation with my family, but I actually had to go through what am I, where are we, what are we doing, what is our belief value set. It was confusing and alienating for me at times, just to basically, what's the right relation? The first belief in our UTOK credo is, I believe in the garden fractal. Okay, so the garden is this idea, what it represents is living wisely. Okay, and then the fractal idea is in right relation to the scope of being. That's what the fractal idea is. And so one of the things is that I cannot, I'm a flea relative to the Titanic. If we're on a Titanic, the idea that I'm going to save the world is like a flea saving the Titanic. This is just not. It is a fantasy. It is not what's real. It's not part of, and to then sit in existential angst that I'm just a flea on the Titanic is clearly not a garden fractal, right?
Yeah.
I'm an unbelievable colony right here. I have billions of organisms that are right here, and I have real relations right here. Beautiful real relations, right? Right here. So cultivate the garden fractal, exactly. And if you are, an oil executive, think about your role as oil executive, right? Or a leader of a country with an army, think about, of course, they're massive systemic things, but for each of us, we're all garden fractal potentials. And we're actually, relatively speaking, to like Planck size, we're actually really huge. We live a super long time in Planck lengths, and we carry with us a whole ecology inside of us, and we relate to whole other ecologies. So in terms of scope and size, we're unbelievably tiny in some ways and unbelievably huge in others. Find right relation and move from there. And that's what I'm hearing in that piece for myself. So that's what it sparked in me. And it's a beautiful way of framing it, passionate and cool.
Thank you. Yeah, no, like that shift is so important, because like there's a way in which, like, for example, like this is gonna help create the ground for the rest of my thinking, like for the rest of the thoughts that are coming up. It's children learn from their parents by what they do. I think what their parents do, they look at the actions. They learn less from about what they hear, right? And the words that the parents say. So there's a way in which, by us as individuals acting in the world and finding right relation, we become an embodied example for every person that we come across. Because we all learn from other people's actions. Like, we think we just listen to what other people say, and like, but no, we actually, I think this is my hypothesis, that like we actually grow and learn and get more information about the actions that people take. The actions are more true to telling us what this person's beliefs are and how they really see the world, right? So there's a way in which the only thing we can do, I think, is embody the change that we want to see in the world. Right? And through that, there's a great potential for impacting every person that we come across proportional to how much work and how deeply we can embody that change that we want to see. Right? So yeah, that's kind of what this, I was kind of like trying to express in a way, like partly the part of what I was trying to express in the piece, and something that I've become really passionate about in terms of like, you matter, I matter, each us as individuals matter. And only us as individuals stepping into this way of being can we create any change. And that really like hits, like it's really means a lot to me, because I feel a lot of people crippled by that existential angst that you were pointing to, and it's so disheartening and it's sad, and it's like I want to do everything I can to be an embodied example of stepping into the existential angst and move forward in spite of it, right? The courage to be, right? The Talekian courage to be, right? Self-affirmation, and not as in this egoic, self-centered, egoic-centered way of being. No, this ontocentric way of being, of self-affirmation, and in spite of the fact of non-being, because that existential angst is there. The goal is not to get rid of it. The goal is to face it and step up to it and step into it for the sake of realizing the vacuity that we were talking about, of flowing with energy information, right?
Lovely.
Yeah. So this, I'll come, there's one more piece that I think is a good transition that would be good to leave off, because the piece that I just said was kind of early on trying to figure out, how am I going to act in the world, and what do I need to invest my time in? Can I change the world? No, like I need to change myself. There's another shift that happened to me in how I relate to myself and my environment. And this piece reflects that. So I'll just go and then we can talk about it after.
Lovely. Okay.
By which principles do you adhere? Is it faith or fear? Which one of these forces steer your wheel? Are you trying to run away from an inescapable fate driven by a tyrant? Or do you practice love, trust, and patience regardless of your environment? As I begin to build an inner citadel, while sitting in stillness, I ask myself, what am I still unwilling to feel? Yeah.
Yeah. I can feel that one reverberating.
Yeah, good. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is an expression of a vow, a deep, deep existential vow that I make to myself, to do all that I can to recognize the ways that I'm living and acting out of fear, and find a way to cultivate my faith as a way of being and a way of acting in the world. And when I say this, faith also is faith in fear, because there's a way in which we run away from fear. And Jung has that quote of, where your fear is, that's where your task is. Right? And I firmly believe that. And there's a way in which we need to stand in the face of fear and face our fear, as in like stand in the face of it.
Totally.
And face up to it and revere it. There's a way in which we need to honor it.
Yep.
We need to listen to it and enter in relationship to it. And I think that is a standpoint of faith, that reverence of fear, that standing in the face of it and not trying to escape. right? Because when we try to escape fear, we live in fear.
Mm-hmm.
We live as fear, and we forever act from that place of fear, and that is so destructive.
Totally.
So destructive, right?
Yes, this is super relevant, and for certainly my own personal world, and how to manage radical acceptance. So you'll hear me sometimes say, I still fear the torturer's chair. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and that's basically like, okay, if I'm placed in the torturer's chair, I will regress into the fear mode in all of its thing. And I will almost certainly just try to escape that. Like, my wisdom energy centeredness, it will obliterate at the level of a torturer's chair. I just accept that. So I'm not, maybe some people can manage that. I think the training that would be required and the mindfulness, I don't have that. And a lot of my shit's intellectual. I need to really do Green Beret mindfulness. I don't know if anybody really can survive that. So I'm not really prepping myself to survive that, okay, at the egoic level. But really, the rest, when you frame it like that, I'm actually able to survive the egoic slings and arrows of my life. Now, within that, so if I can't, okay, but, this group is really pissed off at me and they criticize me in a particular way and attack me. This threatens my sense of ego. I don't get enough respect. I'm this, my Masia says this, blah, blah, blah. I'm here in Brazil. I don't get what I want, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All of that frustration, right? All the fear and all the fact that I'm going to die and the fact that, this is going to come crumbling down. Contact and presence with that and centeredness with that, but not to dismiss it, but actually to hold it in both honor it and vacuity and just basically be there with it and be and even appreciate it. We're just part of the ways of being in the world. But not be gripped and driven into it. I'd say the dragon's lair of neurosis. Like, oh my fuck, I need to escape. And the triple negative neurotic loop just is, and it's fine.
Exactly.
With all of it, with this layering. So anyway, that's my reaction to that. I had to sit with that one for a while because that went right to sort of like, how do I relate to the faith fear inside of me?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a way in which fear. People talk about addiction as a reciprocal narrowing. I don't know. That doesn't feel complete or too accurate because for me, it's what's beneath the addiction. Why do we turn to addictions? Why do we what are we escaping from? There's a way in which addiction gives us a reprieve of something, I think. Right? So for me, I think what's underneath that is fear. So I think fear is the source of the reciprocal narrowing of the world and how we see the world. I think that's what it is. I think fear is the source of the reciprocal narrowing that leads to addictions, right? Because addictions is this narrowing in on something, right?
Well, the way I would hear that is as follows. So if there's a core emptiness, a concern, a felt sense of, oh my God, I won't tolerate this, especially for there are a number of different things that actually lead to the addictive frame. But one is to escape from the trauma. And if it is to numb the trauma, then as the numbing happens, you create this very interesting dimension whereby the numbing goes, but you create the dependency on something that is trapping you, right?
Yeah.
And that's like it will pull you for a while, but it's also pulling you down back right into it as it pulls you out of it. And I think that's kind of the cycle of there's a procedural and perspectival narrowing, meaning procedurally I'm going to engage in this. It's going to pull me away briefly, but only to remind me of how much I want to escape this, how dependent I am. And to the extent that I pull in, I actually have more fear and emptiness of the bad kind of emptiness, like I'm an empty soul with no meaning and worthlessness in my world. And this is my path out, but it's the path out leads me right back in. So that's one way to potentially maybe characterize the narrowing.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Yeah. And it's like, yeah, like there's many ways people get addicted. And like, I think I'm just trying to point to it's like fear, I think, is always, or most of the time is at the root or close
Right.
to the center. Right. And when I say fear, it's like there are objects of fear. So there are things we fear, but there's also fear itself.
Yep.
And I think fear itself is a fear of uncertainty. So I think this is also maps on to the anxiety
Right.
that the courage to be
Totally.
talks about,
Lovely.
right?
Right.
Fear
And
of
that's what
uncertainty.
totally. And that's what my own commitment to is I am now at a place where I can see the little demons in my head that are gripping the future or gripping the past, right? But I have certainly got to a place where I can train myself to be in right relationship to those demons. Okay.
Yeah.
In the here and now of the torture chair, maybe not, but don't succumb, or build courage to manage the demons of thought of past and future, the demons of future and present are actually, I believe we can train ourselves clearly. I can train myself to manage those things quite well. I'm not going to submit and be eaten by the demon of my future thought.
Yeah. Exactly. Right. And that the fear of uncertainty is that way in which we are crippled by the existential angst. Right. And for me, the first piece that I said is like the beginning is, or the second piece, I need to purge myself from this incessant sense of urgency. I know this is just a manifestation of my fear of uncertainty.
Right.
And this second piece, or this last piece that I just said, I got the numbers all wrong. This last piece that I just said is a way in which I was trying to address that, the first couple lines of that, in terms of like, what is this, faith or fear? And then my faith, as in, I think in a way, faith can be a reciprocal opening.
Yep.
Right. And then fear is that reciprocal narrowing. Totally. And it's like, how am I seeing the world right now?
Yep.
Am I opening up to the possibility of the moreness by attuning into the deep suchness of this present moment? Or am I succumbing to my fears and expectations of what could happen and all the ways I could be harmed and narrowing my capacity to really be here? Right? Therefore, closing the possibility of the moreness of the moment and of my life and of myself to emerge. Right? So the last line is, what am I still unwilling to feel? That's influenced by Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate. And that's where I learned that line. So it's like, what am I still unwilling to feel is something I ask myself all the time. And I think in a lot of people's lives, what they're unwilling to feel is fear, right? A lot of people run away from fear every step of the way, or run away from any sort of discomfort, and especially in this age of comfort, which that's technology is making everything more and more comfortable and easier, right? But there's a way in which we need that discomfort, and we need to venture forth into the fear for the sake of development and for the sake of growth, also for the sake of any sense of meaning in life.
Totally.
Right? So yeah, that's kind of...
Yeah, no, in my family, raising my kids, my wife and I both we believe in emotional calluses. Right. I'm like, so if you feel a little shame, you feel a little fear, you feel a little, embarrassment. Yeah, actually, it's not like, oh God, no. It's like, yeah, in this situation, it's not you are shameful, but you did something that was situationally shameful. Feel a little bit of that. Feel the injury of the cut knee. We will protect the system to a degree, but not at the level of protect you from these emotions. That's a totally misguided way of framing. So contact with emotions, comfort with discomfort at a meta level is unbelievably crucial. And learning how to presence. The last thing I'll say is I hooked up with this guy a couple of years ago, very interesting character, developed this philosophy of one divide around which then ended up aligning quite a bit with the way I mapped out the influence matrix in the primate heart, which basically says that there is a core organizing flow for relational value that you approach. Like, okay, it's consistent with what Rogers called the organismic valuing process, only this would be relationally. Like, all right, here is what I value, and this is what I can express positively. This is what I can approach. And this is what I'm terrified about. you know?
Yeah.
And he called this the true self, false self divide, whereby if you were like, oh my God, I'm terrified, then all of a sudden you build all of this character armor, to use a Reichian term, character armor, to protect yourself from falling into the thing that you're terrified of. And you spend all your time essentially structuring an avoidance. And unfortunately, even if you manage to avoid, you end up actually living life empty and fearful because you never know that you're actually grounded in anything. And all of that defensive armor can be broken through at any time, you know? Yeah. But if you learn to ground both into the fear and into approach and learn to flow through approach while holding the necessary avoidance in context, you then ground yourself in the organismic valuing process and feel centered around the true self expression. And I think that relates also to what you were saying about ultimately kind of grounding yourself in the flow.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I think that maps very well. And like, there's a way in which only when we are exposed to fear and become intimate with fear and start to be with it, can we actually learn what not to fear.
Exactly.
Right? So, but we need that sensitization of what is it that we fear that we actually don't need to fear.
Totally.
And we can only do that by entering in relationship with fear.
You have to have contact with it and evolve through it. Totally.
Exactly. And continuity with contact deeply connects with faith, right? So there's a lot there.
There's been a lot there throughout today, you know? So I think the audience knows why I wanted to have this conversation now. It was a glorious romp through a very both erudite and beautifully articulated set of concepts, friend. You really do have a wonderful way with words. So I really appreciate and I appreciate your journey. You know, I mean, I think that's why I wanted to share this too. You have a journey I think a lot of folks can learn from, can relate to, can pull courage and faith from. And that's a beautiful thing. And I think you're a beautiful person, and I appreciate you coming and sharing your story with us and your talents.
Thanks so much for having me on, Greg. I love it. I deeply appreciate it, and I deeply appreciate you. And man, I'm just so excited for whatever's coming and future conversations.
Well, the other thing we'll make a plug for here is the Consilience Conference, right? We have April 12th. Mark your calendars, folks. April 12th and 13th. We've got the UTOK Consilience, and Faisal will be with Owen and Ethan and doing some UTOK art stuff, and there'll be a whole bunch of other super cool presentations. John and Layman Pascal and Benita Roy and Alexander Barr and a whole bunch of other folks coming and exploring philosophy for the 21st century, which we definitely need, I think. And you've got certainly brilliant and beautiful things to say about it. So thanks so much for coming on and sharing. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Greg.